Gaius Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, victor over Pompey's legions, and now, dictator for life. To some, he was Rome's savior, to others, he was a tyrant in the making. But what was Caesar really killed for? Was it fear, ambition, betrayal, or something far more dangerous? Let's step back into the final months of Caesar's rule, to uncover the events, choices, and suspicions that led to the most famous assassination in history. Julius Caesar secured a decisive victory in the civil war by crushing the last remnants of Pompey's forces at the Battle of Munda in Spain. This triumph made him the undisputed ruler of Rome and granted him the title of dictator for life, a position that meant absolute power until his death. Yet, not all of his enemies had been eliminated. Among them was Sextus Pompey, the son of the legendary Pompey the Great, who held control over Sicily. At the time, Sicily was of immense importance to Rome, serving as the Republic's primary source of grain. Whoever controlled the island wielded a powerful advantage in Roman politics. Despite this, Caesar was reluctant to launch another war. He hoped instead to reach an agreement with Pompey's son and resolve the conflict peacefully. This seemed possible, as Rome did not face an immediate grain crisis. Caesar's alliance with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, ensured stability. The fertile Nile Delta supplied Italy with plentiful grain, securing Rome's food reserves. While avoiding conflict abroad, Caesar remained in Rome, focusing on consolidating his power and preparing for a grand new campaign, this time against Parthia. His popularity among the people was immense. It was fueled by generous distributions of money and grain, spectacular public games funded by the state, and sweeping debt relief measures for housing rents in the capital. He also did not forget the legionaries who had fought by his side for 13 years, first in Gaul and then in the Civil War. Some troops were discharged and rewarded with generous land grants in North Africa, Spain, Greece, and Pannonia. The younger, battle-hardened legions remained in reserve. It was these forces Caesar planned to lead in his future campaign against Parthia. These measures not only cemented his authority with the army but also deepened the soldiers' personal loyalty to him. At the same time, Caesar weakened the influence of the old senatorial aristocracy, especially the conservative Optimates faction, by expanding the Senate. He appointed many new members drawn from the provincial elites of Spain, Sicily, Narbonese Gaul, and North Africa. Moreover, he granted senatorial status to many of his commanders, former legitimists, and officers who had served under his command in Gaul during the Civil War. As a result, the number of senators tripled, from 300 to 900. For Caesar, this was not merely an increase in the number of senators. He saw in this an opportunity to transform the Senate into an instrument of his power and a reliable means of strengthening control over the provinces. Ultimately, the new senators were expected to show personal loyalty to him, or at least, that was his intention. However, Caesar's unlimited power and sweeping reforms aroused growing concern among the Roman aristocracy. This was especially true of the former supporters of Pompey and members of the Optimates faction, who viewed Caesar not as a reformer but as a potential tyrant. Many began to suspect that he intended to destroy the Republic and seize absolute power. Accusations that he sought to establish a monarchy became increasingly frequent, a charge of the utmost seriousness. The Romans prided themselves on having overthrown their last king, Tarquinius Superbus, in 509 BC, and on founding the Republic. From that time forward, the very word rex, meaning king, became almost an insult. Any attempt to restore royal authority was perceived as a direct threat to Roman liberty. This fear had tangible consequences as early as the 1st century BC. Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, the hero of the defense of the Capitoline Hill during the Gallic invasion, was executed merely on suspicion of aspiring to become king. At that time, even the slightest hint of royal ambition could prove deadly. Nevertheless, whether intentionally or not, Caesar increasingly gave the Romans reason to suspect that this was precisely what he desired. He received a new honorary title, Pater Patriae, or Father of the Fatherland. Public ceremonies were held in his honor, sacrifices were offered, and games and theatrical performances were organized. For many, this was no longer seen merely as a tribute to an outstanding statesman. It began to look like royal veneration. Moreover, at Senate meetings, Caesar refused to sit in the traditional curule chair. Instead, he seated himself in a luxurious chair with a high back, decorated with gold and ivory. It was most likely connected to his chronic back pain, as by this time he was already 55 years old, and decades of military campaigns had taken their toll on his health. Nevertheless, His opponents used this image to spread new rumors. They claimed that Caesar was already sitting on a throne. The situation was further aggravated by the symbols surrounding him. He regularly wore, not only during his triumphs, a purple triumphal cloak, red boots, and a golden laurel wreath. To his enemies, this looked suspiciously like royal attire and a crown. It is difficult to say why he chose such an image. The historian Suetonius suggested that the laurel wreath helped him conceal his baldness, which, according to accounts, greatly troubled him. At one Senate meeting, Caesar did not rise, even though tradition required him to show respect to the senators. Perhaps this was due to physical discomfort, but many interpreted it as a sign of arrogance and contempt for republican customs. The situation was further inflamed by rumors regarding his relationship with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. It was said that Caesar intended to marry her, violating Roman law, move the capital to Alexandria, establish a monarchy in the Hellenistic style, and declare their son Caesarion as his heir. It is difficult to determine how much truth there was to these claims. Considering the powers he already possessed as dictator for life, the adoption of the title of king would not have carried much legal weight. It would have been more symbolic than anything else. Yet Caesar's silence in response to these provocations gave many reason to believe that the rumors had some basis. One of the most notorious scandals broke out when a royal diadem was placed on a statue of Caesar. The people's tribunes Gaius Epedius Marulus and Lucius Cassius Flavus discovered the golden inscription on Caesar's statue in the Forum and immediately ordered it to be removed. Since this inscription symbolized both Jupiter and monarchy, the act provoked an outburst of anger among the citizens. Tensions rose even further on January 26, when during a procession along the road, some people in the crowd began to call Caesar Rex, meaning king. Caesar responded with wit, saying, "Not Rex, but Caesar," thereby emphasizing that Rex was both a title and a cognomen. However, the tribunes ordered the arrest of the man who had first spoken the word. Caesar reacted harshly, accusing the tribunes of inciting unrest, stripping them of their offices, and expelling them from the Senate. This decision shocked many, since the office of tribune was considered sacred, and the tribunes themselves were traditionally inviolable. Caesar's actions undermined his reputation among the plebeians. The most alarming signal came on February 15, 44 BCE, during the festival of Lupercalia. Before a large crowd, Mark Antony, who at that time was Caesar's co-consul, approached him and attempted to place a diadem on his head, declaring, "The people offer this to you through me." The crowd's reaction was restrained, and Caesar refused. Antony tried again and again, but Caesar continued to reject it. Eventually, he took the diadem but immediately offered it to the temple of Jupiter, declaring that only Jupiter had the right to be king of the Romans. This gesture was met with applause from the crowd. However, many believe that the entire scene was a carefully staged provocation designed to test public opinion. Had the crowd responded positively, Caesar might well have accepted the crown. His opponents quickly spread an alternative version of events, claiming that Antony had intended to sacrifice the diadem, while Caesar eagerly reached for it, hoping it would be accepted. Thus, Caesar remained balanced on the edge between dictator and king. More and more people began to believe he was preparing to take the decisive step. By the end of February or the beginning of March in 44 BCE, a conspiracy was taking shape in Rome with a single purpose: to kill Julius Caesar. More than 60 senators participated in the plot, though history remembers the names of only about 20 of them. At the head of the conspiracy stood Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Both were close acquaintances of Caesar, though during the civil war they had supported Pompey. After his victory, Caesar not only pardoned them but also allowed them to return to political life, granting them high offices. Yet gratitude soon turned to unease, and unease to hatred. Several former allies of Julius Caesar also joined the conspiracy. Among them was Decimus Junius Brutus, one of his most loyal supporters during the Gallic campaigns and the Civil War. Caesar had rewarded him with honors, high offices, and his personal trust. His betrayal remains one of the most puzzling questions to this day. Some historians believe he was influenced by his relative Marcus Brutus, who was at the heart of the conspiracy. The list of conspirators also included other former allies, loyalists, and prominent figures of the dictator. Among them were Galba, Tullius Cimber, Lucius Minucius Bacillus, and others. One of the most significant was Publius Servilius Casca, one of Caesar's closest and most trusted friends. According to tradition, it was Casca who struck the first blow. The motives of the conspirators varied. Some sincerely believed that Caesar sought absolute power and posed a threat to the Republic. Others were driven by disappointment, as their hopes for rewards and influence had not been fulfilled. Still others were motivated by personal grievances or fear of losing their positions. The conspiracy was no spontaneous act, it was carefully planned. At first, the conspirators considered attacking Caesar in the Forum, a public place saturated with political symbolism. But it soon became clear that the Forum could easily fill with Caesar's supporters, ready to rush to his aid in case of an attack. The plan was changed. The assassination would take place during a session of the Senate, a closed gathering where no guards were allowed, and where the conspirators held numerical superiority. This ensured a swift, decisive strike without outside interference. Initially, some conspirators proposed more radical measures, eliminating not only Caesar but also his closest allies, Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus. However, Brutus firmly opposed this. It is believed that he genuinely wished to preserve republican ideals and wanted the assassination to be seen not as a bloody coup, but as a symbolic act of liberation. On the eve of the fateful Senate meeting, Caesar remained confident and calm, despite numerous ominous signs. His friends repeatedly urged him to hire personal guards, at least a few legionaries. But Caesar stubbornly refused. His reply entered history: "It is better to die once than to live in constant fear of death." These words were spoken with pride and almost stoic calm, yet they also carried a faint note of fatalism. It is said that on the night before, Caesar's wife Calpurnia had a troubling dream, a vision of her husband's death. The next morning, during religious rituals, the priests declared the omens unfavorable. Caesar, who always took such signs seriously, decided to cancel his appearance at the Senate session. This threatened to unravel the entire conspiracy. In just 2 days, Caesar was scheduled to depart on his campaign against Parthia with his loyal troops. Once he left Rome, the conspirators would likely lose access to him forever. Realizing that another chance might never come, they decided to resort to deception. They sent Decimus Junius Brutus, one of Caesar's closest and most trusted allies, to persuade him to change his mind. Brutus urged Caesar not to break his commitment, warning him that it would be seen as a grave insult to the Senate. Caesar relented. According to the accounts of Suetonius, Plutarch, and Cassius Dio, Caesar had several chances to escape his fate. One of his friends, having learned of the conspiracy, hurried to warn him, but tragically arrived too late. Caesar had already set out for the Curia. Another messenger also failed. He reached the Senate house only minutes after the dictator had entered. In one version of the story, on his way to the Senate, someone even handed Caesar a note containing a warning about the plot. Yet instead of reading it, he simply tucked it away with other documents, where it remained unopened. Earlier, as Plutarch recounts, a well-known soothsayer had already warned Caesar. Beware the Ides of March, meaning March 15th. On the very day of the Senate meeting, as Caesar was on his way to the Curia, he happened to encounter this prophet in the street. Suetonius notes that Caesar treated the warning with a touch of irony. "The Ides of March have come," he remarked. To which the soothsayer calmly replied, "Yes, but they have not yet passed." The signs were more than clear, yet fate had already made its choice. That day, the Senate did not meet in its usual Curia, which was under reconstruction, but in the Theater of Pompey. The symbolism was a dark, cruel irony. Beneath the statue of Pompey, Caesar's greatest rival in the civil war, Caesar himself would meet his death. The conspirators had gathered there in advance, awaiting the dictator's arrival. Mark Antony arrived earlier than most, strong, imposing, and feared. Known not only as a politician but also as a seasoned general, his very presence unsettled the conspirators. Although they outnumbered him, they feared Antony might intervene in their plan or give Caesar the chance to escape. To neutralize this threat, Trebonius, a fellow officer and trusted ally of Antony, approached him under the pretext of a private and urgent matter. He lured Antony outside and deliberately kept him occupied, while Antony, unsuspecting, followed him. At that very moment, Caesar entered the chamber and took his place of honor in the Senate, directly beneath the statue of Pompey. One of the conspirators stepped forward with a petition to recall his exiled brother. As he drew nearer, he suddenly grabbed Caesar by the toga. Caesar tried to push him away and shouted, "This is violence." At that instant, Publius Servilius Casca struck the first blow with his dagger. The wound was shallow, grazing only Caesar's shoulder. Shocked, Caesar tried to rise, but another conspirator struck him, and soon the blades fell upon him one after another. He collapsed to the ground. According to some accounts, in his final moments, Caesar pulled the edge of his toga over his head, a Roman gesture symbolizing dignity in the face of death. He was struck down by those he had once called friends. The famous line, "Et tu, Brute," has no basis in ancient sources. It entered history through William Shakespeare's play and later became part of popular culture. Shakespeare freely adapted a version found in Suetonius, who records that, seeing Brutus among his attackers, Caesar cried out in Greek, "Kai su, teknon?" You too, my child? However, scholars consider this detail highly doubtful for several reasons. In contrast, Plutarch writes that Caesar simply groaned and said nothing. Caesar's body bore 23 stab wounds, but only one of them, likely inflicted by Casca, proved to be fatal. Out of more than 60 conspirators, only a small group actually took part in the attack. Gaius Julius Caesar did not fall at the hands of his enemies, but of those whom he had pardoned, elevated, and considered friends. After the assassination, the conspirators hoped the people would welcome them as restorers of the Republic. They were confident their deed would be seen as a noble sacrifice in the name of Rome's freedom. But reality turned out to be very different. The public reaction was far from what they had expected. Most Romans did not support the assassins. Instead, waves of grief swept through the city. Caesar had truly enjoyed the love of the people. To many, he was not a tyrant but a leader and reformer who cared for common citizens, veterans, and the state itself. Now he lay dead, slain by the very men he had once raised to power. The turning point came with Mark Antony's funeral speech. Not only was he Caesar's political ally, but also his co-consul and close friend. Addressing the crowd, Antony held up Caesar's blood-stained toga and vividly described every strike, every wound, every act of betrayal. Then he read Caesar's will, in which the fallen dictator left the bulk of his wealth to the Roman people. He granted each citizen a monetary reward and gave the public access to his gardens on the right bank of the Tiber. The crowd erupted with emotion. Grief and fury merged into a tidal wave of outrage. The people no longer saw the conspirators as defenders of the Republic. They saw them only as murderers. Chaos seized the city, and riots broke out in the streets. Caesar was not buried in the family tomb of the Julii. Instead, the enraged crowd carried his body to the Roman Forum and burned it on an improvised pyre before thousands of spectators. People hurled branches, furniture, clothing, anything they could find, into the flames. This was not just a funeral. It was something greater. It was the people's farewell to their leader. Afterwards, the conspirators were forced to flee, having failed to secure the support they expected. Some escaped to the provinces, others sought help from the army. But Rome had already made its choice. In the following years, most of the conspirators met violent ends, some in battle, others at the hands of the people, and some, like Marcus Junius Brutus, by their own hand. Caesar's death did not bring back the Republic. On the contrary, it marked the beginning of a new and bloodier civil war, one that would ultimately lead to the birth of the empire. But that is another story. If you've watched this video until the very end, we'd be truly grateful if you left us a like and subscribed to the channel. Behind our work stands an entire team, and it means so much to us to see you follow our journey through the ancient world. Thank you. If you'd like to give us extra support, feel free to leave a message of appreciation in the comments. It really helps us grow. We hope to see you next time.